9 U.S. Presidents Assassinated by Globalists by Larry Engel. This is article number 9 about the assassination of President Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd President of the United States who served from 1889 to 1893. His great-grandfather was also called Benjamin Harrison, but Benjamin Harrison V. And he was the governor of Virginia, and he had signed the Declaration of Independence. When Benjamin Harrison was only 7 years old, his grandfather, William Henry Harrison, was elected to be the President of the United States, but then was assassinated, only being in office 32 days. There is actually a deathbed confession that indicates that the Skull and Bones, disguised in the Mardi Gras Society, the crew of Comas, actually murdered William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, President Lincoln, and poisoned James Buchanan, and also killed Huey Long. And they also poisoned James Buchanan and compromised him with poison, so that the president, James Buchanan, who was president before Lincoln, was basically working for the dividing up the nation. Skull and Bones was established for this purpose, for murdering political leaders who opposed the agenda of the globalists. The same cabal that murdered the grandfather murdered the grandson. This mystery story involves a gold mine, one of the richest in the world for a time. This gold mine saw over 1 million ounces exported between 1860 and 1883 from the nation of Venezuela in the Americas to Great Britain. This gold allowed the globalists to manipulate the American economy that was based on gold coins by increasing and decreasing the gold circulating as money. The Venezuelan mine was operated by British immigrants and acted as an English colony on Venezuelan territory. This was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The gold that was being taken out of Venezuela and taken to Britain was being used to manipulate the United States monetary system because it was based on gold coins. And so by increasing the volume of gold coins in circulation or decreasing the volume of gold coins in circulation, you could create either a depression or you could create an inflation. And from around 1789, when our nation began with the Constitution, we have what are called panics. And what the panics really are depressions. And there were major ones and minor ones. And you can look that up. It's good to research that. So what it really tells us is that even though we had a monetary system using gold coins, that just like paper money, gold and silver coins can be manipulated to create an influence, inflation, and a depression. By creating the volume of gold coins or silver coins in distribution, in use, they can create a depression suddenly and very quickly, or they can create an inflation. So this is characteristic of paper money, of course, but it also can be done with gold and silver coins. By mining the gold out of Venezuela and having this large gold mine down there, the British were able to manipulate the gold coin monetary system in the United States. And this caused great havoc and great problems for the American working people. And everybody in America suffered because the British had this gold mine and they could use that gold to influence and manipulate our monetary system. This gold that was being mined in Venezuela, in South America, by the British, forming a British colony against the Monroe Doctrine, this gold was being used to manipulate the United States monetary system. that operated on gold and silver coins. And this causes confusion and havoc among the economy of the United States, causing great harm to working Americans and everybody in America. All you have to do is control the money in circulation. So gold can be just like paper money. If you can control, by stockpiling large amounts of gold or having large volumes of gold, and then put it into the monetary system, you can cause these panics, these depressions. And there were depressions shown in history from 1789, around in there, when our country first started, all the way through all the time up to 1913, when we were having gold coins as our money. That the gold and the silver coins could be manipulated just like paper money and create a depression or inflation by increasing or decreasing the amount of gold and silver in circulation. So these gold mines in Venezuela, being operated by the British, were a very important part of controlling the power, because they controlled the economy of the United States. The gold from the Venezuelan mines going into British hands was being used to manipulate the U.S. monetary system, which was based on gold coins. And they created havoc and what they called panics. We had panics all the time we were on the gold coin standard of the Constitution. All the time that we were there, we had panics almost every 20 years, and lesser ones in between. And these are actually depressions. But they can be easily caused, just like with fiat money, just like with paper money. You can create an inflation or a deflation by increasing the volume of gold coins in circulation. So this gold from Venezuela going into British hands was being used to manipulate the United States monetary system. The gold that they got from Venezuela, the British were using to manipulate the U.S. gold coin monetary system. And this was harming all Americans, including the working man. In doing this, they were able to do what they called panics, create panics, which were really depressions. And this caused economic havoc in the United States. Benjamin Harrison was not assassinated while he was serving as president. However, part of the motive for his murder was his powerful persuasive arguments in support of the Monroe Doctrine, President Monroe's doctrine, and his high status as an ex-president of the United States. The Monroe Doctrine stated that further efforts by European nations to colonize land or interfere with governments in North or South America would be viewed as acts of aggression requiring U.S. intervention. So Holland and France and Spain and Britain had all had interest in North America and South America. In fact, we still have Canada today that's ruled by a queen. So this is what the Monroe Doctrine was about. It actually states, and this may be a little harder to understand, but this is what it actually says: the occasion has been judged proper for asserting, as principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by European powers. That's the actual Monroe Doctrine. Further, in reference to gold mines, President, and at the time private citizen, Harrison had intimate knowledge of the corruption of nobleman Friedrich Freehold von Martens that had caused harm to America and to Venezuela. Martens was corrupted by the Europeans in the Monroe Doctrine arbitration over the Venezuelan territory and the rich gold mines. Being a member of the peerage, that means having a title of nobility, this guy Martens, the Russian diplomat, had supported the peerage in this arbitration, and he was against the equality and freedom of the American people. The peerage is always against freedom and equality. They want special privilege under the law. That's what a title of nobility really is. This corruption was later exposed, but while he lived, Harrison's knowledge of it was an immediate threat to the vain European control and manipulation of the American gold-based economy and monetary system. Harrison was poisoned bit by bit with arsenic by skillful Illuminati doctors while he was being treated for a bout of influenza. This is a method used by Skull and Bones intelligence agents to assassinate other presidents, including his own grandfather. This fact is exposed and proved by the Mardi Gras deathbed confession. Both presidents were murdered because they loved their country and because they represented their nation and the interests of their nation and represented the people of the United States and represented the Constitution. That's why they were murdered. Unfortunately, that would be against the globalist agenda. Around the time just before his murder, Harrison had been appointed by President William McKinley to be a member of a very powerful International Court of Arbitration established by the Hague Peace Conference in Europe. Having ex-President Harrison, with his prestige and great legal skills, appointed to this high position in their own backyard by a powerful sitting anti-globalist president of the United States, deeply threatened the European banking cartel's very existence. Therefore, the Europeans had their Skull and Bones, bloodthirsty werewolves, assassinate both Americans, ex-President Benjamin Harrison and President William McKinley. Of course, the Federal Reserve was being looked at that time too. A few years earlier, to avoid war with Great Britain, the Venezuelan crisis was subjected to arbitration by the President Grover Cleveland. This was arbitration because of the Monroe Doctrine. Of course, from my point of view, this was a big mistake. Instead of going into arbitration and letting, this Russian diplomat get his corruption going against us, from my point of view, they should have sent the Marines and the Navy down to Venezuela to exit the British out of the Western Hemisphere, out of North and South America, as it's required by the Monroe Doctrine. So instead of going into arbitration and getting corruption and cheating, what they should have done was send the Marines. Private attorney at the time, Harrison was chosen to be counsel to represent Venezuela in the Anglo-Venezuelan Boundary Arbitration Commission and was engaged for over a year in preparing his case, concluding it in Paris, September 21st, 1899. The arbitration panel who would make the final decision consisted of Melville Weston Fuller, Chief Justice of the United States, David Joshua Brewer, member of the U.S. Supreme Court. On the British side, we had Sir Richard Hen Collins, Lord Justice of Appeal, and Baron Herschel, former Lord Chancellor. He died, and then he was replaced by Charles Russell, Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales. So they had 2 Americans and 2 British, and then the 5th person was Friedrich Freehold von Martens, a Russian diplomat. Therefore, in this arbitration, we had 2 against 3. 3 of them had titles of nobility. The peerage. They represented a small group of people ruling over the rest of society. On the other hand, we had 2 jurists from our Supreme Court, a country that believes in equality, where the people are supposed to rule themselves, a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. So having 3 wanting to rule by a small number of elite and the only two representing the people, the rule by the people. So the outcome is pretty much determined. Those people with royal titles of nobility are going to hang together against the people that believe in equality. With his tie-breaking vote, the jaded von Martens insisted upon a unanimous decision. American jurists considered opposing this. However, by law, in other words, the agreement for the arbitration, had they not accepted the compromise, Venezuela would not only have lost their rich gold mines, but also a large section of their country. So the Americans reluctantly went along. Therefore, ex-president and attorney Harrison had lost his case to corruption, but won his powerful arguments for the Monroe Doctrine and its place in American history. America's status as a world power came into focus for the first time. This is the earliest example of interventionism under the Monroe Doctrine, in which the USA exercised its claim prerogatives in the Western Hemisphere, North America, South America, Central America, Mexico. However, a half a century later came the publication of documents of a nefarious political deal between the unscrupulous Russian nobleman von Martens and the satanic British royalty over the Venezuelan territory and the copious gold mines. In 1949, the U.S. jurist Otto Schumerich gave the Venezuelan government the memorandum of another guy called Severo Mellet Provost. Provost was the official secretary of the U.S. Venezuelan delegation to the Tribunal of Arbitration. In other words, he was the secretary of the five guys we just talked about earlier. This memo was written in 1944 to be published only after Mallet Prevost died. This document reopened the issues, with Mallet Prevost summarizing a political deal between Russia, the Russian diplomat, and the British jurist from subsequent private behavior of the judges. Mallet Prevost said that von Martens had visited England with the two royal British arbitrators in the summer of 1899. Subsequently, Martens offered the two American judges a choice between accepting a unanimous award benefiting Venezuela along the lines ultimately agreed to, or a 3-2 majority opinion giving much more land to the British and costing Venezuela their gold mines and land. So this is a little complicated, but might report it. The alternative would have been to follow something called the Stromberg line entirely, and given the mouth of the Orinoco to the British. Even President Cleveland, before he agreed to this arbitration, had pointed out that the Stromberg line was an unprovable and fraudulent contrivance of the British. So we're going to take a lot of territory away from Venezuela along with the gold mines. And they said, well, if we all agree to it, we'll take the gold mines and some territory, but we'll give Venezuela some of their territory back. That's why the American judges and ex-president attorney Benjamin Harrison went along with the kind of the dirty deal. The secretary of the arbitration, Mallet Prevost, said that the American judges and the Venezuelan council, ex-president Benjamin Harrison, were disgusted with the situation and considered a 3-2 option with a very strongly worded minority opinion, but ultimately went along with von Martens in order to avoid depriving Venezuela of even more valuable territory to which it was fully entitled. This corruption situation angered Harrison, and his knowledge of it made him dangerous to the globalists. When he was later appointed to the Hague Peace Conference, with all that power, he became very dangerous. He knew about that corruption. It was Harrison's great skill and his inside knowledge of European dirty dealing, and the fact that he was a short time later now serving in a very powerful position on the International Court of The Hague, that made President Harrison a target for assassination. This would also play a part in the assassination of President William McKinley, who had appointed Harrison and who also was involved in a situation as the Federal Reserve came into existence. May 18, 1899, the Hague Peace Conference assembled in response to an invitation issued by the Tsar of Russia. The Tsar said, on behalf of disarmament and the permanent peace of the world. Later, the Tsar and his entire family would be murdered in a revolution financed by the American-based Jewish banker Jacob Schiff, a powerful globalist banking cartel member. The combination of the Tsar of Russia and the ex-president of the United States, Benjamin Harrison, was a deadly threat to the world dominance agenda of the globalists. The Tsar of Russia, who had for years opposed and been a real strong enemy of the Jewish agenda. They call themselves Jews, but they don't seem to be Jews because they follow the Kabbalah and the Luciferian religion, and they don't seem to have anything at all to do with the Old Testament. This banking cartel seems to be a very evil and sinister form of religious belief, if we can call that, but they call themselves Jews. I don't think they are, but that's what they call themselves. So anyway, the Russian Tsar greatly opposed everything they did. So the combination of this Russian Tsar and the ex-president Benjamin Harrison, who was a brilliant attorney, was deadly against the New World Order agenda of dominance of the world. The proposition expressing the desire that international conflicts might be in the future, might be settled through arbitration, was considered by the Commission. Said ex-President Harrison, the greatest achievement of the Hague Conference was the establishment of an absolutely impartial judicial tribunal. This newly formed legal body was a devastating answer to the black nobility, money, and gold corruption that had occurred in the earlier Venezuelan affair. Benjamin Harrison called it an absolutely impartial judicial tribunal. Of course, that's in comparison with the arbitration in which the royalty ruled against the equality people. So this one they set up later was impartial, and that was a terrible threat to the agenda of world dominance by these royal families. Why do the Jewish communities spy in the United States? The Mossad says that they approach the Jewish communities throughout the United States and other places in the world, and they gather about 30% of the people are willing to spy on their neighbors and friends, and spy on their country so that they can eliminate rule by the majority. They want to rule by Jews. They want to rule by the Jewish community, to rule everything and have all the power. And so they spy. The Mossad says that 30% of the whole Jewish community anywhere in the world spies against their neighbors and their nations. And the other 70% will not turn them in. I am claiming that this is unlawful. In order to achieve the takeover of a nation, they have to destroy the morality of the people. And they do that by censorship, by taking out of public domain music and other art that belongs to the community. And they do that in order to lower the morale, to injure the morale, to damage the morale of the community to other people. So they take that, all our music, and they say, well, we have a copyright on that. You can't use that. Well, that's not true. The claims that they have copyrights on these are false. These items are all a great musical tradition, and other arts, for example, the United States, is all available to us in public domain. We can use it. The original people who created it and published the music and so on, all these people have been compensated, and they're gone, and their families are gone and passed on. And so what we have is a public domain, a large amount of music in public domain. So why is it removed from public domain? Why did the Jewish community, using the Mossad together, why did they say, well, we have a copyright on that, you can't use it? Why did they say that? Because that lowers the morale of the public and lowers the ability of the people to resist the takeover of their government institutions and their cultural institutions by the Jewish community. During his term as president, Benjamin Harrison had opposed the European globalist agenda, but he was not assassinated then. His vice president, who would have taken over had Harrison been murdered, was Levi Parson Morton, of old New England Protestant stock, and a diplomat well liked in France. So this vice president was not the globalist man. Therefore, killing the president, President Harrison, would not have benefited the globalists at that time. Benjamin Harrison's administration is remembered most for economic legislation, including the very high McKinley tariff that protected American industry, and also the Sherman Antitrust Act that later would be used by President Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, to totally destroy J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was a powerful American Rothschild agent and globalist factor. The bipartisan Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890 and signed into law by President Benjamin Harrison, is still in effect today after 150 years and was considered to be the most important legislation of the 51st Congress. And this is a quote from the encyclopedia. So Benjamin Harrison was the president who signed the Antitrust Act. Very anti-globalist. President Harrison had served in the Civil War. He was a brigadier general in the Union Army. He won several battles and marched with General Sherman to the sea. He opposed and knew about Judah Benjamin. Judah Benjamin was the dictator of the Confederacy. He was an assassin. He was a British spy, and he was a traitor who ran the Confederacy during the Civil War for the European banking cartel and the Rothschild banking powers. How do I know this? Judah Benjamin held the entire Confederate treasury in his own personal bank account in London. So the Confederacy had no money unless they did what Judah Benjamin told them. The Venezuelan affair was a major event in U.S. history. President Cleveland voiced a momentous message to the Congress in December 17, 1895, which denounced the British refusal to arbitrate and maintained that it was the duty of the United States to take steps to determine the boundary and to resist any British aggression beyond that line once it had been determined. Of course, the British didn't like the Monroe Doctrine, and their response was, the government of the United States is not entitled to affirm, as a universal proposition, with reference to a number of independent states for whose conduct it assumes no responsibility, that its interests are necessarily concerned in whatever may befall those states, simply because those states are situated in the Western Hemisphere. Of course, that's exactly what the Monroe Doctrine said. So no European, no Spanish, no French, no Dutch, and no British colonies in North America, South America, Mexico, or Central America. Of course, we have the British Queen ruling over Canada. I wish those people would wake up. In May 1895, the Royal Navy also occupied a Nicaraguan port of Corinto after a number of British subjects, including the Vice Consul, had been seized during disturbances shortly after the former protectorate of the Mosquito Coast had been incorporated into Nicaragua. Now, this became a very big deal, and the U.S. public opinion was very outraged at this British military activity in the United States sphere of influence. So they didn't think the British ought to be in Nicaragua. American people, that is. Now let's go on to his death. In February 1901, Benjamin Harrison became ill. Doctors were not sure of the cause. Maybe it was influenza or maybe the gripe, they said. He was treated with steam vapor inhalation and oxygen, but his condition worsened. There is no report of an influenza epidemic in the area at the time, and he was surrounded by several people who obviously did not fear an infection. Influenza season is usually earlier in winter and doesn't occur in March. It is not reported that he suffered from any chronic health condition. That is a common factor when somebody dies of influenza. There's usually some additional factor involved. You don't just die of influenza. Very interesting that the president was not given plenty of liquids, which is a proper treatment for influenza. Bowel irrigation, that is, passing large quantities of liquid through the GI tract, would have flushed out the arsenic. My intuition just spiked. Why was such a simple and important influenza treatment not provided? Was it because it would affect the arsenic? Maybe wash it out of his system? President Benjamin Harrison is reported to not have recognized some of his relatives and some of his friends, and that he was mentally confused. But this is not a symptom of influenza or pneumonia. This is definitely, though, a symptom of arsenic poisoning. It's not found so often with influenza. It's not. Did you get confused when you had influenza? Not recognize your relatives or not recognize your friends? No, not when you've had the influenza. You've had a cold. You know what it's like. You don't suffer that. So he was poisoned. He became semi-comatose on Tuesday and was comatose for many hours before he died. He, a wealthy, distinguished person, was not taken to a hospital, which would have been proper with pneumonia or comatose patients in 1901. I was unable to find the full name of his doctors or their biography. What if a doctor or a nurse was actually an assassin? Could they get away with this murder? Now, the Mossad says that they frequently, today that is, use wealthy medical doctors. These doctors and other Mossad citizens of the United States are called assassinated. They spy and engage in espionage within the United States. In fact, the Mossad says that 30% of the Jewish community engage in espionage and spying in the United States, and the other 70% of the Jewish community cover it up and don't report the spying. This is a grave danger to any country but it certainly is influencing the United States. The group at the bedside of President Harrison included Mrs. Harrison, his little daughter Elizabeth, William H. Miller and Samuel Miller, who was Miller's son, the Reverend Dr. M.L. Haynes, the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church, where General Harrison had attended for many years, Secretary Tibbet, the doctors Jameson and Dorsey, whose names I couldn't find or their biography, Colonel Daniel M. Ransell, who was a sergeant of arms of the United States Senate and a very close personal friend of the president, and then Clifford Eric. Also, there were two nurses who had been in constant attendance, and General Harrison's two sisters and an aunt were also present. There is no report that any of them suffered from influenza. Because ex-President Harrison was a leading advocate of the Monroe Doctrine at the time, when America was rising and taking its place as a major world power, Harrison would become a target for assassination by the European globalists. Serving on the International Court at The Hague and siding with the Russian Tsar against the globalist agenda would also make Harrison a target for execution. Ex-President Harrison's capital skills as an attorney in the Venezuelan gold arbitration matter and his knowledge of how the British deception, corruption, and depravity had worked against America's interests to secretly steal and twist the outcome of that arbitration would make him dangerous and a dangerous opponent and would awaken the globalists' wrath against him. He was not a happy camper about the gold that had been taken from Venezuela and used to undermine the American economy. Harrison's opposition would arouse a call for revenge, and a ruthless black nobility and Jewish bankers would insanely lust to make an example of both Harrison and the Russian Tsar. And they murdered the Tsar. They also murdered the Tsar's beautiful young family. All of them. The most common influenza symptoms are chills, fever, runny nose, sore throat, muscle pains, headache, often severe, coughing, weakness, fatigue, and general discomfort. It is rarely fatal by itself. People don't die of influenza unless they have something else contributing to it. You can usually beat the influenza. Arsenic poison will produce similar headaches. It will produce weakness, fatigue, general discomfort, but also confusion that is not usually associated with influenza. The throat, the lungs, and the bronchial tissues are damaged by arsenic, and it causes breathing problems similar to pneumonia. Arsenic is a deadly murder weapon, especially when it's in the hands of an expert medical doctor who has practiced with its use. And the death of President Benjamin Harrison on Wednesday, March 13th in 1901, at the age of 67 years old, is at best questionable. It's a fairy tale. The government official story that he died of influenza is always a fairy tale in every case that I've been examining. It's so weak. There's so little evidence that what the official story is. And yet when you look at it, there's a great deal of motive for killing a president who opposes the globalist agenda. We might assume, could assume, unusually severe but natural causes for his death if the globalists did not have a history of murdering any prominent leader who opposed their agenda. However, it would be naive and devoid of guile and worldly experience not to suspect murder. The banker corporate cartel's message must be sent purposely to all who oppose them, See what happens to our enemies? The globalists are untouchables. They will kill their opposition, and they do get away with it. No government prosecutor would dare to challenge their financial and political power. We are always left with an official story that denies reality, denies evidence, denies common sense, and denies the actual state of world affairs. The official stories can be relegated to the graveyard of hoaxes, frauds, and fairy tales. Do you believe in the Tooth Fairy? Do you believe in the Easter Bunny? Then you can believe the official story of the death of many of our presidents who were really assassinated because they didn't follow the globalist agenda. The globalists will not permit Americans to have a president who represents their freedom, who represents their equality, who represents the interests of the people, who represents the interest of the Constitution and obeys and follows the Constitution. The globalists do not want this. And so when a president has this kind of agenda and tries to do this, every one of them have been assassinated. Why do they do this? Because monarchs, kings and queens, and tyrants do not like representative government. So you need to get that in your head. You need to come to grips with that. Monarchs and kings and queens and tyrants do not like our form of government. They want to be representing their monopoly of businesses and banking and their power. So power in very, very few hands. They don't want the power in the hands of an entire population who elect their representatives. They want the power in their own personal hands. America's founding fathers broke free from the perverted, despotic, tyrannical form of government where you have kings and queens. They broke free from it, and they formed a new form of government. And we're so lucky to have this form of government, but it's up to us to make sure that we understand our own form of government and that we are being attacked by royal dynasties. So see the truth as it is. Kings and monarchs and tyrants do not like our form of government. They don't like officials that are elected. They don't like equality. They don't like freedom. They don't like having people being represented and the people's interests being represented. Benjamin Harrison, whether president or acting as a private attorney, put our nation's interests first. My premise is that this series of articles is that 9 U.S. presidents were assassinated because they represented American interests and thereby became a danger to the globalist agenda. I use my observation, intuition, and opinion to investigate. What always seems to happen as I investigate is the official claims in the deaths of these presidents and others just melt away and become weaker and weaker the more I know about them. While at the same time, the more I learn about the motive, opportunity, and methods of operation of the European black nobility, the Bilderberger Group, the Jesuits, the billionaire Jewish communists, the Masonic New World Order, and their international banking cartel indicates assassination is a tool that they use all too freely. And even more dangerous, they get away with it.